Hey, Chelsea.
Hey,
All right. So I think
can you hear me?
we had a.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
No. Oh wait, that was my bad. My computer's muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. So I guess Professor Tang is not on yet. He had a good presentation. So
Oh good, yeah. You guys talked on Monday?
right.
Cool. I'll send him an email and just make sure he's got everything set up real quick.
Okay, great.
Hello.
Hello and good morning,
Hello.
Professor.
Hi. Good afternoon. Hi, Senator. Can you see me? You can see me now.
Yes,
You can hear me as well.
that's right. And I'm going to make you a co-host to make sure that you'll be able to present your PowerPoint.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So you should be able to launch it whenever you're ready.
Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay,
and
that's good.
Yeah, you can either do it this way or do it in presentation mode.
Yes. Oh, right. Yes. How about this?
Okay. Yes. Perfect.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah. So we can
It's
just
come to
leave
your
it
face,
here.
honestly.
Yeah. So we can just leave it here until it begins, and we'll also start broadcasting on Facebook in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Senator, do you want me to go ahead and put up the background screen?
I think we can just leave it like this.
Would you like me to stop share now? Maybe you can put on your yeah. You can put on whatever. Hi, Chelsea.
Sure.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Thanks for connecting.
And that's fine. Do you want to just leave the PowerPoint up?
You like to put on your backdrop? You said you want to put your backdrop, right?
Either way.
Oh, I mean, you please. I can share when I I can share my PowerPoint at the time when I present. So please.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll
All
have the background. Just let me know when you're going live on Facebook, and I'll drop it, and we can start.
Okay. Well, why don't you? Yeah, you can start now, and then let me try to set it up on Facebook in the meantime.
Oh, cool.
Thanks.
Good afternoon and welcome to this episode of Our Homes, Ending the Housing Crisis. Professor Bosin Tang is the interim head of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at the University of Hong Kong, his alma mater. He's a registered professional planner, a recipient of the Medal of Honor from the Chief Executive of the Hong Kong SAR government in 2019, and a non-executive director of the Hong Kong Urban Renewal Authority. Today, we're lucky to have him present on Hong Kong's unique urban form. Professor Tang, welcome to Our Homes, Ending the Housing Crisis, and please take it away.
Thank you. Senator. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen in Hawaii. This is a morning time in Hong Kong, so I feel greatly honored to join this webinar to share with you some experiences of a high-density living in Hong Kong. So if you may allow me to share my PowerPoint, let me share it now. So I hope you're able to see my PowerPoint, right? It's okay? Okay, good. So in the next 20 minutes or half an hour, I'm going to show you some benefits and problems of our high-density urban environment. So first of all, where is Hong Kong and where is Hawaii? Now this diagram shows you how far we are physically apart. Separated by the Pacific Ocean, we are about 8,900 kilometers or 5,500 miles away, according to Google Maps. Hong Kong is located in southern China, as in Asia. In terms of time zones, we are 18 hours ahead of Hawaii. Another comparison. Hong Kong has a population of over 7.5 million people on a small land territories of only slightly more than 1,000 square kilometers. So our average density is very high. If my figures are correct, our density is more than 3 times that of Honolulu. Now, Senator Chang told me that the whole island has around the same size of Hong Kong, and the population is a bit more, is around 1 million. So you can see that your overall density is even lower. Okay. This diagram shows you the urban form of our city. It shows you how we are using our land. We have only built on 24% of our existing land area, mostly around the harbor here. We call Victoria Harbor, and on both sides of the coast, and also along major transport corridor. So what happened to the rest of the land? This diagram shows you that we have kept more than 40% of our territory as our country parks, similar to the concept of national parks, which are mainly for conservation and recreation. And these country parks are mostly on a hilly area. Therefore, when you look at Hong Kong from the sky, you can see a lot of greenery areas. Indeed, our country parks are internationally famous to tourists as well as hikers because these parks are very close to our urban districts and they have stunning sceneries. But our compact urban form does come with a cost. Some urban districts have tremendously high population density, as you can see from this diagram. In Kowloon, the area circled by yellow here, the population density is 6 to 7 times more than the overall average. In another district, we call it Kwun Tong, the circle here by orange, the density is the highest, which is 61,600 people per square kilometers. So in these districts, you will find buildings being packed together with narrow roads and very little greenery areas. Heat island effects, poor air ventilation, higher urban temperature, and so on are some of the major problems in these old urban districts. But on the street level, you may be able to find a lot of vibrancy and a lot of convenience and attraction, like what these pictures has shown you. Now, to tackle urban congestion and to build more housing, since the 1960s and 1970s, our government has begun building new towns outside the main urban districts. So far, 9 of them have been built, and in fact, we are still building, to help decentralize the population and provide a better living environment. As you can see from this diagram, these new towns are built outside the main urban core. This is the main urban core, and they are connected by highways and railways with the main metropolitan districts. And you can see they are built with much lower densities from this as you can see from this diagram. One example is the Tai Po New Town. As you can see, the land area, the population level, the density look similar to the figure I got about Honolulu. Now, all new towns have comprehensive planning and design in order to create a pleasant living environment. Balanced community is one of the key planning objectives in building this new town. We provide a mix of social housing, we call it public housing here in Hong Kong, and also private housing, together with a lot of open spaces and other community uses. In Tai Po, this is the plan for Tai Po. For example, the new development is also planned with the villages. And an industrial park, the area colored by orange, is also built to provide employment to the people. So with good urban planning and design in new town, you can see that urban users can blend well with the countryside. High-rise development can avoid urban sprawl and also allow conservation of our landscape areas, the agricultural land, our heritage sites, and also other traditional village uses. Now, our compact city and also a high-density development make it very effective to have transit-oriented development. As you can see from this diagram, we have very high concentration, in fact, of our urban users. Very high proportion, indeed, are within walking distance away from a metro station. Walking distance in Hong Kong means 500 meters away, so around 5 minutes walk. And indeed, over 90% of our daily commuting relies on public transport, including mainly metro lines and also public buses, but also ferries and taxis. So for metro development in Hong Kong, we call this the rail plus property or R plus P model, and is internationally quite famous. This model allows our metro company to leverage on the real estate values to finance both the construction of the metro lines and also sustain the fare revenue without government transport subsidy. This is indeed an amazing achievement. If you're interested in how we can do it, you may refer to my 2 previous studies, okay? You can find this from Google, the document from Google. Investment in metro lines can also lead to urban spatial changes, like decentralizing the offices and housing away from the congested urban area. If you are interested, you may refer to my recent paper about the spatial changes in Hong Kong. Now, I'm going to show you some example of how we can have high density development and the TOD. High density development work extremely well in Metro Station in Hong Kong. Now, Kowloon Station is one of the showcases. In a land area of around 13.5 hectares, we can build 19 towers, including the tallest building, this one. We called it International Commercial Center with hotel on top and Grade A offices. The developer of this project referred this as the vertical Wall Street because according to their estimation, it provides around the same amount of office spaces along Wall Street in the US, but piled up vertically. The whole station is a mixed-use development with hotel, service apartment, residential, and also landscape garden put on top of a shopping mall with Metro Station, downtown check-in counter for the airport, and also public transport interchanges. So you can change from metro to buses and the other way around, all in one place. Another showcase is Cheng Yi Station. This is a high-density mixed-use development, but without offices. Here, we have residential towers on top of a commercial podium shopping malls with Metro Station and other ancillary facilities and community uses. In this development, you can experience what we mean by seamless integration. You can come out from Airport Express train after arriving at our international airport, and you can move immediately into the shopping mall and get back to your residential apartment upstairs. Or you can pass through the mall, try to grab a cup of coffee, and then transfer easily to the local lines or buses, all under one roof. Now, high-density development does not necessarily have to be in the metro station or urban center. In Ma Wan, this outlying island, you can see that we can also build a comprehensive private development that blends very well with the village area, the local heritage, public beach, and also the countryside, leaving a lot of greenery areas. Of course, all these require very careful planning and design. Of course, our urban development does have a downside. Housing affordability is still a major problem to many people of Hong Kong, including the younger generation. As you can see from this diagram, our housing prices have been rising quite rapidly. So no matter what statistics you are referring to, Hong Kong housing cost is undeniably very high in global standard. The living condition of our low-income families are very poor if they do not receive public subsidies or support. So to economize on housing costs, many families are staying in very tiny units. We call it in Hong Kong subdivided units or subdivided flats, meaning they are self-contained, smaller units modified or transformed from a bigger, single, larger apartment. And these units could be as small as 5 square meters or less with everything inside. So you can see we still need to find land to build more and better housing for our population. Now, before closing, I would like to highlight 3 final remarks. First, as you can see from our New Town example, with very good urban planning and design, high-density development can enhance the livability of human settlement. Second, whether high-density development is suitable to a place or replicable to other cities depends very much on the local context. For example, the culture, the aspiration of the people, the constraints, and so on. Last but not least, in my view, the success of high-density developments ultimately rests upon good citizenship. What does that mean? That means it requires a lot of tolerance among people, sharing, because there are a lot of interaction. You need to care about each other. You need to have mutual adjustment and so on. These characteristics or attributes, if you like, are, in my view, also the key characteristics or qualities of what define a successful city. So this is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for listening. And so I pass back to Senator. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tang, for that excellent introduction to Hong Kong's urban planning. We already have our first question from the audience, and it asks, has the COVID-19 pandemic changed public attitudes about high-density housing? And I might also add that Hong Kong has had a very low case count despite its extremely high-density housing model since the beginning of the pandemic.
This is a very good question. Okay, thank you very much, Kenneth. The answer is no, because I think Hong Kong people is very used to high-density living. I think the situation is that I think COVID-19 has not indeed changed attitude. I understand in other cities, okay, people are leaving the cities, okay, where in other cities they are experiencing what they describe as a de-urbanization, okay. But in Hong Kong, I think we believe that high density development can enhance livability. So the situation is at the moment, I don't detect this kind of change of attitude.
Okay, great. Professor, you've done a great job illustrating just how dense Hong Kong is, and you also mentioned at the end the importance of the local context. Can you just give us a quick thumbnail of how it came to be so dense? As you know,
Right.
in many cities, including in the United States, density is, a very unpopular concept among the local people.
Indeed, indeed. Yes, Senator. In fact, if people can Google the pictures of what Hong Kong looks like back in the 1950 or 60, you will see that at that time, indeed, we are having a lot of temporary housing because each year we have increase of population of 100,000 people. So over 10 years, we have increase of 1 million people. So you can imagine if we have to accommodate that many people, okay, without proper housing, we indeed at that time experience the situation like in many developing cities where we have squatters area in many parts of Hong Kong. And in fact, those squatter areas were not very satisfactory in terms of housing condition. So if you go back to history, you will be able to see that indeed the reason why we have to go to high-rise development was indeed primarily aimed at trying to accommodate the population, especially the increase in population, and also to help to solve the congestion problems. But indeed, you can see that in the urban area, you are still having congestion. So that's why our government has to build new town and new development area to provide even better housing in a living environment. Okay, so I think high density developments is indeed a kind of situation that we have to solve the housing issues. Okay, and on a small piece of land like Hong Kong, that we have to go vertical. Okay, rather than horizontal. So I think that probably is one of the very, very important historical reason why we have come up to this situation. Okay, but of course, I understand in the United States, high-rise development or high-density development does not. It's not. It's not something that is in favor by the people. I was listening to a seminar last evening by a Harvard professor telling me, in fact, this was indeed something that is very cultural, that related very much back to the idea of the American dreams, okay, and could be traced back to the idea of your founding fathers. So that, as I said, okay, that relates whether high density development is indeed something that is suitable to an area depends on the local context. So I hope I answered the questions.
Yes, great. Thank you. You mentioned in your presentation, Professor, the MTR Corporation, excuse me, which is the transit agency, but it's also a publicly traded profit-making corporation that is majority owned by the government. I don't think in the American context, there is any transit agency with that type of structure. And we have a question from the audience on how do state-led institutions like MTR incorporate commercial principles to stay efficient and deliver needed transit and housing and office space?
That is indeed a very, very good question. Okay. In fact, in the presentation, I showed you one of the reports examining the operation of the metro, the Rapid property model. Indeed, in that report, I did desktop research about experiences in other cities, especially like in the US. Okay, and indeed, the MTR, the company in Hong Kong, is indeed a very, very unusual indeed. While it is company that is set up by the government, it indeed operates under the ordinance, okay, what we call the MTR ordinance. And we call this a statutory organization because it's an organization set up by statute, and all the operation and the principles indeed are laid down in the ordinance. And in the ordinance, it specifically says that the company has to operate under commercial principle. So it is not a company, it's a company set up by the government, but it's not entirely an organization that is led by the government. It's kind of, to some extent, an autonomous organization that operates according to the principle laid down in the ordinance. So in the ordinance, it says specifically that this company has to operate under prudent commercial principle. Okay, and in fact, before the company, in fact, of course, as you know, as you just said, okay, this company is now public listed. It's around 24% of the share being public listed. It's still majority owned by the government. But before that, it was majority owned by the government. But even if it was majority owned by the government, it was totally owned by the government at that time. The company operates, according to my understanding, independently, according to prudent commercial principle, in the sense that it may not take up projects that they do not find it financially viable. So they also have to go through their own independent appraisal of whether a particular line is commercially viable before they engage or they decide to build on the line. So that's a very important aspect that probably set the MTR Corporation very different from other, if you like, public transport organization, which I understand mostly, in fact, belongs to the government or in fact government departments.
So in other words, MTR is acting basically as a private corporation, as a profit-making, profit-maximizing corporation, right?
I'm not sure whether it's profit maximization is something that is appropriate, but according to the principle in the ordinance, it has to operate under prudent commercial principle. In other words, it has to be financially viable. But whether it's maximizing profit or not, I think it depends on your judgment, honestly. But the bottom line is the company has to make sure that the project is financially sustainable. So when they decide to build the metro lines, they have to make sure that they have sufficient finance to support the construction, a lot of costs, of course, and also they have to make sure that after the completion, they have sufficient ridership to support the operation. So both in financial terms, both the capital expenditure, CapEx, and also the OpEx, operation expenditure, they have to make sure that they have to meet up with the financial requirements.
Right, and I believe MTR is unique in the world as never having received a taxpayer subsidy, even for its capital expenditures, which is, again, very interesting.
The subsidies is in terms of, if you like, to some extent on land supply. Okay, one of the very important supports from the government is exclusive land grant to the MTR. But having said that, the land grant is not without cost. In other words, the company has to pay back the land cost to the government. Okay, so the operation is indeed very, I mean, as I said, okay, in the report, if you are interested, you go back to the report. I describe the R+P model not as a physical design model. It's not a design model. It's not simply something like urban planning and design, okay? It's in the report, I say it's an institutional model. In other words, you have to have the right institutions to make sure that you have the right incentives and also the constraint, okay, to put every player to do their best. That is what I describe as the success of the R+P model in Hong Kong. Okay, so no, not even though the government is not giving direct capital support, the government does give support to the metro company in terms of, for example, land grant, not without cost, but also policy support. For example, government has to make sure that in planning, they would concentrate the highest density around the metro station and try to decrease or regulate or reduce density away from the metro station. So you kind of concentrate the urban activities around the most accessible area. So this is indeed a very important means of support to the metro company because it kind of encourages ridership. You don't want to build a metro lines without people using it. This is not going to be healthy, in fact, to the metro line. So it's another way of support, if you like.
On this webinar, we've had many guests talk about the phenomenon of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, the anti-density movement, the pro-community preservation movement, which has successfully blocked a lot of densification in places like Hawaii and in California. Can you describe the process of community input for proposed developments in Hong Kong? And is there any advice that you would offer to the United States where community opposition can be very vocal?
Thank you very much. I think that relates very much to the last point I mentioned about the success of high-density development. It relies on good citizenship, honestly. In other words, you need to have tolerate. You have mutual adjustment, okay, and understanding, empathy as well, okay, of each other in order to work out, in order to make sure that higher development can succeed. And this is indeed what city is about. It's not just about trying to take care of your own living environment and forget about the rest. This is not something that makes the city successful. So indeed, you're absolutely right. Okay, some people may also be very against, okay, increasing density, densification of the districts. Okay, we indeed in Hong Kong we also have experienced not exactly the same form, okay, but in similar form that people are objecting to certain kind of development, okay, but that is why you need a lot of consultation. And indeed, now in Hong Kong, whenever you have any particular projects, you have to carry out public consultation to explain to the neighborhood about what exactly this project is about. You also have to make sure that you offer planning gain to the neighborhood to be able to convince them this is something that is bringing benefits to the community. Okay. So there's no straightforward answer as to what would make a project successful, or definitely something that is going to eliminate all objection. every project would definitely attract some objection. But what we are trying to do is to make sure that we are pursuing a project that is for the public interest. That is very, very important. And that is what makes a city successful. So no easy answer, Senator, to this question, honestly. Difficult job. And that's why politicians and government officials have to work very hard.
So speaking of community opposition, as you know, Chief Executive Carrie Lam proposed a plan called the Lantau Tomorrow Vision in October of 2018, which would involve land reclamation, building new islands out of the open ocean of 1,700 hectares, which is, I think, probably over 3,000 or 4,000 acres. That would include between 260 and 400,000 homes to 700,000 to 1.1 million people, of which 70% of the homes would be public housing. And this has been the government's proposed solution to Hong Kong's housing shortage. What has the public reception been to that plan? And is that one of the factors for why the plan, after over 2 years, has not made much visible progress?
That is a big proposal, honestly, because you're talking about a huge investment, and also the plan will have very significant also implication on the environment, on the urban form. So this is something that is not going to be happening within a short period of time. But I would say that, first of all, this is only one of the proposals of trying to increase land supply for the future development of Hong Kong, only one of the proposal. And of course, indeed, this is also a very controversial proposal as well. So, but this is not the only one. The second point is, as I showed in my presentation, housing affordability and is indeed a major problem in Hong Kong. Many poor families, low-income groups are still not living in very satisfactory situation. And one of the solutions that we are trying to help is to make sure that we find new land supply or new land to build better housing and more housing for them. Okay, so Lantau Tomorrow, as you just mentioned, is one of the proposals to try to increase land supply, okay, to solve, if you like, housing problem, but not only housing problem, but for the future development of Hong Kong. Okay, so either we are going to keep our country parks, okay, as you can see, we are keeping a lot of land for country parks, and that is indeed the cost we have to pay. We have to find elsewhere for new land, and indeed, Lantau Tomorrow is a big project, and I think the objective is to make sure that government has sufficient land bank to be able to provide new housing, but also community uses as well, open spaces, hospitals, schools, and so on and so forth for the future development of Hong Kong. So very controversial at this stage, but we have to start the first step of planning, of consultation, of evaluating the implication, and so on.
Another question from the audience. So we already discussed how the MTR is required to operate commercially, and they do tend to put market rate housing near the transit stations, which tends to be more expensive, and public low-income housing is located further away from transit. Does this impact the mobility for lower income residents, for seniors and other residents of the public housing?
Good question, very good question. The reason why private housing is built on metro station, I think it's based upon economic principle. If you go back to the study I showed you on the PowerPoint, you will see that in fact, based upon study, it makes economic sense to put private housing closer to the metro station. I think because of I think at least two reasons. First of all, you will see that if you are going to put the private housing a bit further away from the metro station, it will affect the ridership quite a lot, indeed, because as you can expect, for the private household or the better off household, they probably have more choices of transport means or transport modes to travel or commuting. So if you move the private housing a bit further away from the metro station, that would affect or that would discourage them to use the metro. Okay, based upon data I used. Okay, and another reason is that in fact for the public housing a bit further away from, based upon my study, it does not affect that much the type of users of the metro lines. Okay, so putting them a bit further away looks like it's still making economic sense. And indeed, if you come to examine the actual development or the design of the metro station, you see that they are indeed very much connected, well connected with the public housing estate as well, by either like footpath, by bridges and so on. So even though they are located a bit further away, it looks like the walkability or the accessibility is not that much affected so far, it looks like. Okay, so I think that is the reason why private housing is built mostly on the metro station. And don't forget, a lot of these private developments in fact are generating returns to the metro company in order to finance the construction of the railway. So if indeed public housing is built on the metro station, it may not be able to generate sufficient return for the metro company to be able to finance the railway. So that's another reason why private housing is built on top of metro station, mostly a bit closer to the metro station.
You mentioned that the market rate housing, the wealthier families tend to live directly on top of the rail stations. And as you know, in the United States and places like Hawaii and California, there's a heavy dependence on car transportation. The developments that you showed in your presentation have very few parking stalls per unit. Is it, I mean, how many parking stalls per housing unit can we expect to see in these transit-oriented developments? And without private cars, how are Hong Kong residents able to access their jobs, which could be located anywhere in the city, their schools and their universities, which are again scattered throughout the city, necessary services like buying groceries, buying food, and also recreational activities like the beaches and hiking trails that you mentioned?
Right. First of all, indeed, all these first of all, the uses that you mentioned. Okay, I think I showed in my one of the PowerPoint, telling you that in fact we concentrated our urban development on only 24% of the land, and mostly along transport corridor. Okay, and these transport corridors are connected by the roads, highways, and especially metro lines. So people can indeed travel on metro or public transport with access to different uses. This is the first point. Second point is indeed on this metro station, we are not talking about single uses. We talk about mixed uses. So indeed, a lot of these are ancillary uses like shops, and indeed sometimes schools. Okay, in fact very close. Okay, to the living places. And that also implies that because they are so close, you may have you need to drive to access these places. They are within indeed walking distance or walking distances, not far away indeed. Okay, so one of the benefits of high density development is convenience, because every use is so close to each other. Okay, so this is the point that I want to make. And you talk about car parks. Okay, without going to details, it varies. The ratio of car parking ratio varies across different development and across different time. And I think without going to details, I think for urban areas, you probably expect maybe only one car park space for maybe 2 units or apartments units, 1 or 2 apartment units. But for areas which are located further away from the urban areas or not connected by metro, you probably may expect maybe 1 car park per unit. Okay, I think this makes economic sense because for the urban high density districts, because it's so conveniently connected by public transport, metro lines and public or bus services and so on, you probably do not need to rely on cars, the use of car to travel. And the fuel provision of car parking spaces also discourage people to use car to transport or for daily commuting as well.
So in a place like Hawaii, people would say, you know, I need my car because I need to go to Costco so I can buy 96 rolls of toilet paper to stock up for this pandemic. I need to buy my week's worth of groceries, you know, to stock up due to this pandemic. And I need a big car, and I need a big refrigerator, and I need a lot of living space. So how do Hong Kong residents deal with stocking up on groceries or toilet paper or other supplies?
If Tesco is just downstairs, you don't need to stock up that much food in your refrigerator, right? Do you? Because you can get down to Tesco if you need, okay, any fruit. If the restaurants or whatever are indeed just right downstairs, you don't need to stack up that many foods in your home. You can have more spaces for your gym or for your bicycle or for your other or living rooms, right? You don't need that because they are in fact downstairs. That's what is the benefit of mixed uses and in very accessible location. Okay, maybe just 1 station away, or indeed, in fact, just downstairs. So this is the benefit of high density development. That you try to put the uses together very close to each other and maybe vertically rather than spreading them over the place. I can understand that the reason why you need car to get to supermarket because they are further away. They are not connected by public transport. So that relies very much on the urban form and on your planning of your city. Where are you going to put the users? Okay, are they just downstairs or are they very far away? And how you're going to connect the users? Okay, that depends on your planning of the city.
I appreciate that because I think a lot of people who have not lived in a high density mixed use development like that would have a hard time imagining how it actually works.
Indeed. The professor the seminar that I attended yesterday evening was telling me indeed I think for big families, okay, with children, okay, probably they would still love to live in the countryside. Or this is not going to go away. Suburban area, for example, in the United States, I can understand. Okay, they want bigger, more open area cars, okay, because they have bigger families. But according to the information I received yesterday, you're talking about in America maybe 15% of the people with families, okay, children and so on. But in fact, the rest, okay, 70, 80%, maybe they are young professionals without children, not family, singleton, elderly. They might be in favor of high density living, or they are not in that. They are not against, if you like, high density living. Okay, they might like, in fact, to be close to restaurant, to be go to theater. Okay, so you're talking about. It looks like, okay, from the information I received, looks like there is a big demand for kind of development, apartment development and that sort of development. So you're talking about different type of a changing type of demand. maybe in the US, I believe. Okay, but of course, I can also see the constraints in trying to provide a bit more high-rise development, especially in the urban area, because of land ownership issue and so land value, and so I can understand as well.
So as we all know, it's widely accepted that Hong Kong has one of the world's, if not the world's, most severe housing shortage. People are living in subdivided units, as you described. The housing market is so expensive that if you had $1 million on average, you could only afford an apartment that is 363 square feet, or the size of about 2.5 parking spaces. And that would be for $1 million, which in most cities would be a very expensive housing unit. Now, that being said, Hong Kong has made a lot of progress. You mentioned that squatter settlements, which are like slums that existed, in the 1980s, as late as the 1980s, have pretty much been eliminated by this point. And what I was personally surprised to find was that the wait list for a Hong Kong Housing Authority public housing unit was only 5 years long. I shouldn't say only, 5 years is a long time. In Hawaii, it can be over 10 years to wait for a Section 8 voucher. In Los Angeles, which I visited, it can be over 15 years to wait for a Section 8 voucher. And in Hong Kong public housing, the average rent is only about 8 to 9% of a family's income, whereas a Section 8 voucher requires that you contribute 30% of your income to the housing rent. Now, I'm not sure how housing shortage is measured, but I think we can agree that Hong Kong does have a serious housing shortage. And if we were to check back in 20 years from now or 50 years from now with plans like the Lantau Tomorrow vision, like the assembly of underutilized parcels like a golf course in Fanling, are you confident that Hong Kong will no longer have a housing shortage in 20 years or 50 years?
Very good question. According to the policy address just announced by the chief executive a few weeks ago, she is telling us that at long last, the government has been able to find 300 hectares of land to build public housing. Okay, so indeed, it looks like the government has now figured out a way to find land to build public housing. Okay, because there was a kind of a bottleneck in the supply of public housing over the past maybe 5-10 years in Hong Kong. That is why, and largely due to the reason of the lack of land supply in the past. Okay, that's why, as you said, Senator, that we now have a much longer waiting list to get into the public housing estates or public housing apartments. Okay, 5 years, indeed very long, Okay, so if our chief executive is correct, so hopefully we are going to see a major increase in supply of public housing. But indeed, the Hong Kong has always been living on a situation of a big uncertainty because our society is so open to external influences. Okay, over the past, like population inflow back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so on. Okay, where we were facing an increase of population of 1 million per 10 years, per decade. That's why housing shortage was a big problem. And we've also been very open to income or capital flow into our city, so that in fact a lot of the in fact some of the apartments, especially higher price apartments, are owned by the non-local people, that taking up a bit of a demand. Okay, so it depends very much on whether our supply will be able to catch up with the type of demand, and also subject to the changes that we are facing in terms of population, in terms of external economic changes, and so on. So it's difficult to say, indeed. Okay, but it looks like what we are trying to do is to try to address the problem from the supply side, meaning we're trying to find land, build more housing, and indeed to try to address the housing needs of the lower income group. That is the approach that we are trying to do. Okay, difficult to say, trying the best, and that's what planning is about. Planning is to try to prepare for uncertainty.
So speaking of uncertainty, as we all know, sea level rise is impacting cities and coastal developments around the world. Honolulu recently set up an Office of Climate Change and Resilience. How is Hong Kong responding to the impact of sea level rise on coastal developments? And do you have examples?
Very good point. Very good point. Very good point. Climate change is something that is indeed affecting not only Hong Kong, not only Hawaii, but also all over the world. Okay, I think this is an issue that I think our government has been very concerned with. So you mentioned about Land Out Tomorrow as an example. Okay, and we're trying to reclaim land. And indeed, many experts are telling us that, okay, you have to address the issue about sea level rise. So if you're trying to build, for example, new land by reclamation, reclaiming the sea, then we did have to make sure that we have to have the site formation, this sort of thing being addressing the issue. Okay, so that is, I think, one of the very important issues. But not only sea level rise, but also other climatic issues as well. So for example, we are trying to reduce our heat island effect. So for new development, especially in the highly dense area, you have to carry out a very stringent and very detailed environmental studies, especially about, for example, air ventilation. Okay, so we have for new development, we have to make sure that the environmental assessment have to meet up with the standard today, more stringent standard than in the past. So not just sea level rise that we are addressing, we also have to address other environmental issues related to climate change as well.
We all know Hong Kong is famous for a laissez-faire, pro-business economic system. In fact, it's been ranked as the world's freest economy for many decades in virtually every survey conducted of those measures. But about half of Hong Kong's population actually lives in current or former public housing that was constructed by the government, compared to the US, where it's only in the low single digits. Is there a tension between the interests of private sector developers and the government, which is concerned about providing large amounts of public housing? Has this extremely large governmental intervention into the housing sector been detrimental to private sector development and activity?
Very good question. Indeed, we talk about different types of housing models, right? Like what you just said, in Western country or Western cities, mostly we're talking about a majority or major part of the housing being provided by the private sector. But in the other extreme, like for example, Singapore, you are talking about perhaps a majority of the housing provided by the public sector. Hong Kong is somewhat in the middle, that 50% of the housing is provided by the public sector, and then another 50% of the housing, if you like, is provided by the private sector. Okay, and indeed, I think it relies on a very delicate balance, because the public sector housing will indeed have some influence on private sector housing. And but at the moment, I think the issue, the policy is the public housing provision is targeted for those who cannot afford private housing. And indeed, we're talking about the concept of a housing ladder. So for those who are low income, in a low income sector or low income group, low income household, that they cannot afford private housing, the government have to come in to provide subsidized housing, either in terms of rental, or mostly in terms of rental, for, as you said, okay, 10% of the income being used for rent. And for those sandwich class, for example, they don't have sufficient asset to buy private housing, the sandwich class people, under certain income limits or asset limits, they may be able to purchase the subsidized sales flat provided by the government. And we also have another category called starter homes. Starter home means that for those who have not owned housing before, okay, if you are falling into a certain income limit or asset limit, you may be able to get the rights to purchase these starter homes. So they are subsidized flat. The price are lower, but also they got restrictions for resales. Okay, they got restrictions for resale. You cannot resell. You cannot sell to the market. And I think you rely on a delicate balance because the supply of all these subsidized housing is indeed not sufficient to cover the whole population. And indeed, for those who are in this sector, I believe they have an expectation or aspiration to try to move up the housing ladder to the private sector housing if they indeed got the sufficient asset. Okay, so we're talking about a kind of healthy type of escalation of people if they are not able to afford the private housing for maybe for a while, they can stay in the public housing sector. But if they have got sufficient amount of income or asset, they can move out to the private housing sector. And in those sectors, they don't have any restriction on resales or uses and so on. But if the public housing sector, there are a lot of restrictions. Okay, so there's a bit of a delicate balance, okay, between the two. And indeed, I don't think from what I can see, the Hong Kong government can provide sufficient public housing to satisfy all the needs of the Hong Kong population. So there's still a lot of rooms for the private sector developers to provide housing for the population. So I shouldn't say there is a big tension. I don't think there's a big tension because you're talking about dividing the market.
Great. In Hawaii, we constantly use a term called carrying capacity to refer to the maximum population that our islands can sustain. And usually we refer to fresh water supply. Is Hong Kong's fresh water supply an issue in planning for population and housing growth?
Very good question. Luckily, we have our housing water supply secure. We have our own reservoir, okay? We have our own reservoir, but indeed we are very lucky to be able to secure long-term contract with the mainland government, especially our neighbor, okay, the Guangdong government, to secure freshwater supply from Guangdong province. So water supply, as far as I can see, is not at the moment a constraint. But indeed, I can understand some experts are telling us that water is something that is going to be increasingly scarce resource, and we have to worry about it. But at the moment, water supply is not a constraint to urban development in Hong Kong. I think that depends. That also because of our, we are very lucky, okay, to get the long-term contract of securing water supply from mainland China. Okay, but indeed this is a major issue, I think.
So unfortunately, our time is short. So let me ask our two final questions together. First of all, as you know, Hong Kong is one of the world's wealthiest and most vibrant cities. It can be considered a smashing success, especially when you compare it to, you know, just our parents' generation or a couple of generations ago when it was a very poor, very backward place with very, very inadequate housing and lots of squatter, slum encampments. And yet it doesn't seem to be widely hailed as a model of development of urban planning for other cities around the world. Why do you think that's so? And then our final question will be, do you know if Hong Kong University has programs to cooperate with the University of Hawaii so that folks in Hawaii will be able to learn more about urban planning and design from Hong Kong?
I asked the second question first. I'm from the Department of Urban Planning and Design. Okay, we used to be a center of urban planning and urban studies. The founding director of, we established this center back in 1980s in Hong Kong, in University of Hong Kong. The professor, the founding director of this department, the center, in fact, I think is now in University of Hawaii and Manoa. My teacher, indeed, is now in University of Hawaii.
Oh, what's his name?
So Professor Reggie Kwok.
Oh.
He's a retired professor, okay? So he knows everything about urban planning and in Hong Kong, and of course also about urban development in China. Of course, he is, I think he probably has retired already. So you have your expert, my teacher, indeed, at home. So please look for him and please send my best regard, okay? And so this is the second question. The answer to the second question. The first question is, indeed, I think Hong Kong is famous on a number of things internationally. Public housing development, okay, especially in the past. I attended a seminar by a historian a few weeks ago, showing me pictures about how we indeed back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, all the time, we tried to address our population problems, okay, building insufficient housing, and the resettlement of these people in public housing. So historical time of overview. You will be able to find this from YouTube, in fact, the seminar that I talked to about resettlement. And indeed, he was showing me pictures about all these celebrity and government leaders like Margaret Thatcher, okay, parliaments, from British Parliament, from other developing countries, coming to visit our public housing programs, okay, back in the 1970s, 60s, and 80s. So we are not having this sort of massive building program anymore because you see our city has been quite mature now. So you are not going to see all these big, massive planning or development program. But I'm telling you, in fact, in the past, not long ago, in fact, a public housing program was one of kind of world famous in terms of how we can, within a short period of time, trying to provide housing for a huge amount of people in Hong Kong. So this is the first thing. Second is the TOD I mentioned, the R+T model is also something that is, I think, attract also international attention. Why we are able to have a metro company that does not rely on government financial subsidies in terms of transport and the construction of metro is also another something that also attract international attention as well. Okay, so these are at least two, I think, two aspects. Another is the country parks. Okay, the country parks development is another something that is also, I think, also attracts international attention. So we got quite a number of, if you like, planning or projects or achievement that probably may interest, whether they are indeed top of the world, I cannot say, but also will attract international attention and also government leaders to come to learn. In fact, I understand you came some time ago to talk to our MTR people, okay, how they indeed plan big projects, okay. So this is not something that I think you're absolutely right. This is something that is also very, very, I think, internationally famous. So I shouldn't say that we don't have anything to show to the international community. We do have some, indeed, a planning achievement that we can show. But of course, as I said, we also do have our own problems.
Just to elaborate a little bit more, we saw a public housing estate on our delegation in 2019, the Ontat estate in the New Territories,
Right.
that had a density of 585 units per acre. Do you think that that level of density is a good idea to export to the rest of the world?
As I said, this refers to my final remarks. It depends on the local context, local culture as well. Okay, and aspiration of people, acceptance of people. I think our high density model is something that works in Hong Kong. Other cities may not need to go up to that level of density, honestly. But whether you might wish to increase a little bit, and whether it might be helpful, in my view, I think from a sustainability point of view, complexity, a bit more densification may work in other contexts. You may not need to go to that extreme level like Hong Kong, okay, of density. But from an environmental point of view, from sustainability point of view, if the local context allows you to do this, I think this is something that is worth pursuing, in my view. But that relies very much on very good planning, urban planning and design as well.
Well, unfortunately, we're over time, and I want to be respectful of your time, Professor Tang. Thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise with us today. We very much look forward to the opportunity for you to visit us in Hawaii and in the United States again, and for
Definitely.
ourselves to travel to Hong Kong to learn about the successes of the Hong Kong model as well. So thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.